Hello, Augies Worldwide. I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG, here with another episode of Ask Dave. I was sent an interesting radio to review that is a MURS radio, the multi-use radio system. Now, you're probably familiar with the FRS, the Family Radio Service, and a bunch of people have radios for that. Now, why is that of interest to ham radio operators? Simply, if you're at field day or working a special event or something like that, and you need close communications with other participants, maybe some who are not even hams, the little FRS radios do a good job. These can be used by anybody for anything that's legal, basically, as long as it's not illegal, immoral, or fattening. And the FRS radios are in the 400 to 500 megahertz range in there. There's a little set aside of frequencies for that. A proper FRS radio, which you've seen in multiple reviews that I've done here, are very handy to have. Well, it turns out that FRS is not the only approach to these multiple use radios. There is something called MURS, multi-use radio system. It's not quite as flexible as Family Radio Service. It does not have as many channels or anything like that. It is limited to 2 watts. However, you can put up an outdoor antenna, even as much as 65 feet high. So, I mean, they're different. They're pro and con. The FRS, you can't even unhook the antenna. On the MURS, you can. There aren't nearly as many channels on MURS. And it has one prohibition that might make it less useful for some. Now, let me tell you what really brought this around. There is a YouTuber by the name of Tucker Gott who does fabulous YouTube videos on using these personal parachute type things. You sit in a little chair, you've got a propeller at your back, and you've got a sport propeller over your head that forms the wing, and the propeller guides you, and by pulling on various cables you can go in different directions. In one of his movies where he did some stuff near Moab, he used a little handheld radio, and the first thing that came out of it was channel mode, and just like the Baofeng does. And I thought, oh my God, he's using Baofeng radios. That could mean he's using ham radios. And so let's look at alternatives for him. And I did look at the Family Radio Service, and now we have the MURS. But before I review that radio, which I'll do in the next video, I want to talk about what MURS actually is. It's nowhere near as well known as other Part 95 radio services, like Citizens Band or Family Radio Service, but it is of great use and can be used in many of the situations that you could also use a Family Radio Service for. Now, what I want to do here is do a brief overview of FCC Part 95 services with focus on MURS, the multi-use radio service. It's a full-fledged service, just like amateur radio is a full-fledged service. Okay, let's take a look at Part 95. We're going to look at the table of contents here. We're in Title 47 of the Federal Code of Regulations in Chapter, I think that's Chapter I, probably, the Federal Communications Commission, Telecommunications. That could be Chapter 1. That's a problem with using sans serif fonts. You can't tell if an I is a 1 or what. Probably Chapter 1. Okay, Subpart D, Safety and Special Radio Services. Then we go into Part 95. Now, amateur radio is Part 97. Okay, it has its own part with a lot more detail than any of these do. Here we have some general rules: the Family Radio Service, the CB Radio Service, the GMRS or General Mobile Radio Service, lots of other little things in here. And then subpart J right here is the multi-use radio service. Now, since the chapter or subpart J is not very long, I thought I'd just very quickly run through it so you can tell what MURS really is and if it's something that might be useful for you. For example, if you're a family and you're going out for a hike and there are 5 of you or something, you can all be on the same FRS channel or the same MURS channel. Okay, let's take a look at this. So we're going to go down here to subpart J, the multi-use radio service. MURS is a two-way, short-distance, voice or data communication service for facilitating personal or business activities of the general public. There's something about grandfathering in old MURS stations that operated before the year 2000. So you've got to be at least 22 years old to remember that. Okay. Now, here's something very interesting and a little sad. Part 95.2707. Notwithstanding the provisions of Part 95307, which is in another service, MURS operation is not authorized aboard aircraft in flight. Now, for somebody like Tucker Gott, this rules it out, because even a flying parachute or a powered parachute is an aircraft. So you can't use this for air to ground or anything like that. Family radio service, you could probably do that. But here we would be like in a camp or nearby people or so on. If you're going to do anything in the woods that involves any distance, you probably want to look at the General Mobile Radio Service, or GMRS. Although that does cost money to get a license, the interesting thing about it is that the license is good for your entire family or organization, as long as it's formal. So a lot of hunters use these, and the key thing about it is you can put up repeaters. You cannot put up repeaters here. Okay, so let's go on. MURS replacement parts. Now, remember, in amateur radio, you can do anything you want to your radios. You can modify them, you can fix them, you can create your own radio and put it on the air as long as it meets the FCC emission specifications. This is not true of other radio services, and that is the case here in MURS. The operator of a MURS transmitter may replace parts as indicated in this section. All other internal maintenance and repairs must be carried out in accordance with 95.319, which means somebody else. Okay. You can replace a damaged antenna with another antenna of the same or compatible similar type, and batteries in the MURS transmitter may be replaced with batteries of a type specified by the manufacturer. Whoopee. You hardly do anything. Now, MURS stations must take reasonable precautions to avoid harmful interference. In other words, monitor the transmitting frequency before you use it to make sure nobody else is using it. Note this is completely open to the public. Nobody needs permission. They've got permission by right in here to use the radios. Permissible MURS uses can transmit voice, data, or image signals. Okay, may be used for telecommand and telemetry functions. So here's something family radio service you can't do. Family radio service is just FM voice. Here you can actually send data. MURS must not be operated as repeater stations or signal boosters. This prohibition includes store and forward packet operations. And you go, I just looked up here and it talked about data and image signals. But no, you cannot do a store and forward type thing. So it's transmitting from one MURS to another MURS, okay, without a repeater or anything like that. Now, normally, since the MURS, the way the MURS work is voice, and you'd have to basically use something you can hold up to it that would create the data signal if you wanted to send some data packets. MURS antenna height limit. Now this is different from family radio service. The highest point of any MURS radio antenna must not be more than 60 feet above the ground or 20 feet above the highest point of the structure on which it is mounted. Well, if that doesn't get you up to 60 feet, just put some poles up or a mast. MURS station antennas must also meet the requirements regarding menaces to air navigation. If you look at air navigation, here's a sectional chart. Okay, and you'll see on here that there's a little section right here that has to do with towers. Towers are annotated on these maps, and that way aircraft can find their way around them, okay, and it won't be a hazard to air navigation. Now, normally, you got to be above 200 feet, but just make sure that you're absolutely okay on that. MURS network connection. The answer basically is no. Station is prohibited from interconnection with the public switch telephone network. Interconnection defined connection through automatic or manual means with multi-use radio stations with the facilities of the public switch telephone network. In other words, dial-up. To permit the transmission of messages or signals between points in the wireline and radio network of a public telephone company and persons served by multi-use radio stations. Wireline or radio circuits are links furnished by common carriers which are used by licensees or other authorized persons for transmitter control, including dial-up transmitter control circuits, or an integral part of an authorized private internal system of communications, or as an integral part of dispatch point circuits in a multi-use radio system are not to be considered interconnections for purposes of this rule part. Now, I'm going to let you figure that one out. Okay, there it is on the screen, right there, in beautiful black and white. Okay, MURS stations must not be operated in continuous carrier transmit mode. In other words, they can't be part of a data, let's say, telemetry type of a system that's constantly transmitting the information. That could be a little widely interpreted, depending on how you look at it. Now, MURS transmitter certification. And this is true of most radio services, except amateur, although amateur's got a little bit of this too. Each MURS transmitter must be certified in accordance with this subpart and part 2 of this chapter. Okay? So, in other words, it's got to be a MURS radio. It can't be a radio operating on MURS frequencies. It's a MURS radio. Okay, grant of equipment certification will not be issued for any MURS transmitter type that fails to comply with all the applicable rules of the subpart. A grant of equipment certification will not be issued for MURS transmitters capable of operating under both this subpart and under any other subparts of this chapter except Part 15. In other words, if you get one of these old Baofeng radios that transmits DC to light, and it will cover the MURS frequencies, right there, it's against FCC regulations to do it. Just because you can do it does not mean you are permitted to do it. For example, just because someone can drive drunk doesn't mean that it's legal to do so. So this is that old thing about, oh, the government's regulating my behavior. Well, you bet it's regulating your behavior. It's making you stop at red traffic lights. It expects you to go on the green ones. It expects you to not smoke on aircraft. All of these kinds of things are government regulations that we take for granted. I remember when seatbelts first came out. I was 16. My dad bought a Volkswagen that had mounts for seatbelts but didn't actually have the seatbelts. Those were an optional extra, which my father would not pay for because he did not want the government telling him what to do. So I went down and to the VW agency and actually purchased the seat belts. It was $20. It was a week's wages. So I put them in, and oh, my father was furious. He refused to wear them, but I wore them. And then it became mandatory to wear them. And now we don't even think about it. We just put them on, which is the wise thing to do. Think of seat belts as a public health rule. The public health is part of the, in the preamble to the Constitution, it talks about serving the general interests of the public. That's where our public health structure comes in. And they can do things that are injurious to the public health, including you. For example, if you don't put your seat belts on, you're not going to hurt the other guy if you're in a crash. But your medical bills would be higher. And guess what? That comes around and not only makes your insurance rates higher, it makes mine higher. So put your seatbelt on. Okay, anyway, you get the idea that there is a rule here. Now, the MURS channels, what are they? They're VHF. This is different from a family radio service, which is UHF. These are VHF, and they're just above the 2-meter band. 5 VHF channels are allotted for shared use in the MURS. These channels, designated by their center frequencies in megahertz, are as follows. 151.82. Okay, so we're just 3 plus a little bit megahertz above the 2-meter handband. 151.88, 151.94, and then it skips up 154.57 and 154.6. Now, each MURS transmitter type must be designed to transmit on one or more of these frequencies. Now, MURS transmitter types must be accurate. Transmitters that operate with an emission bandwidth 6.25 kilohertz or less, think narrowband FM, must be designed such that the carrier frequency remains within plus or minus 2 parts per million. Okay, parts per million means that you can go up or down about a kilohertz here. Okay, that's actually a pretty sloppy, loose spec. MURS transmitters that operate with an emission bandwidth greater than 6.25 must be designed such that the character frequencies are within plus or minus 5 parts per million of the channel center frequency during normal operating conditions. Remember, you can transmit other than voice. Now, since you can't change the radio, you'd have to buy a radio that will do this, or just have an audio over the, air gap and put audio in there that will transmit your signal. Okay, we're actually getting real close to the end. There's not much more here. Each MURS transmitter type must be designed such that the transmitter power output does not exceed 2 watts. Okay. Now, here you get a little funny. MURS emission types. MURS transmitter must transmit only emission types A1D, A2B, A2D, A3E, F2B, F1D, F2D, F3E. Emission types A3E, F3E, and G3E may include selective calling or tone-operated squelch tones to establish or continue voice communications. Okay. MURS transmitters are prohibited from transmitting in the continuous carrier mode. You can't just turn it on and leave it on to save a channel or something like that. Save it for yourself for later. MURS authorized bandwidths. Let's see, the occupied bandwidth of emission transmitted on the center frequencies 1.5182, 1.5188, and 1.5194 must not exceed 11.25 kilohertz. The occupied bandwidth on the other two channels, 15457, 1546, must not exceed 20 kilohertz. The occupied bandwidth of type A3E emissions, I think that's single sideband, must not exceed 8 kilohertz. Okay. Now, here's your unwanted emissions limits. These are the little things, meaning that here's how bad you can be transmitting out of band while you're transmitting. And but there's a bunch of stuff in here that's very technical. 7.27 times the F of D, which is in kilohertz, minus 2.88 kilohertz, and that gives you a dB number, measured bandwidths, and so on, and that's it. That's all that it talks about. So what good is MURS compared to family radio service? Well, in family radio service, you have more frequencies. Family radio service tends to be more line of sight because you cannot detach the antenna or put it up on a high tower. MURS is a little bit more good for transmitting telemetry or stuff like that, although it can't do it continuously. Okay, so when it has telemetry, it transmits, and you have to be sure that, the usual politeness rules apply. Check the frequency for other people using it before you broadcast. That can be done automatically too. Okay, so there are lots of different things you can do with MURS. There are only 5 frequencies, and the key thing that's too bad about MURS is it cannot be used aboard aircraft. I do not recall a similar restriction for FRS. So, for Tucker Gott and all of those who want to use walkie-talkies between their powered parachutes and the ground, use FRS, okay? You can't use MURS. You'd probably be better off with FRS anyway. Note that both FRS and the MURS allow you to use tone squelch or CCTSS tones to give you some sense of privacy. Note that if you transmit using one of those tones, because your recipient is respecting that, anybody with any radio tuned to that MURS channel can listen in. You do not have privacy, and as usual, encryption is not permitted. Now you might say it's not prohibited. Well, this is a case where if it's not permitted, don't do it. Now, there was a very long section of legalese in there for using MURS for some paging and stuff like that. So that might work out fairly well for you. But notice you are limited to 2 watts. Now, on FRS, on some of the channels that overlap with GMRS, you're allowed to use 2 watts, but otherwise it's a half watt. Okay, so strictly for local communications. Now, I think the takeaway from all of this is to have all the people in your party get their ham license, because then you can go on 2 meters, transmit as many watts as you want, put outdoor antennas on it, put an antenna on the roof of your car, change things out, do all kinds of stuff like that, and you've got far more than the 5 MURS channels or the 22 FRS channels, or even GMRS, which has additional channels and can use repeaters. So, something to take a look at, something to think about. If you'd like to help support this channel, go to dcasler.com/support. Please subscribe. Please click like. And until we next meet, 73.